Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Jacqueline Jerry Folotia. I am the Senior Foundational Learning Expert at ADEA. We're pleased to have you here. So today's webinar is focused on benchmarking. The objectives of today's webinar is to foster collaboration and peer learning among African countries on national literacy benchmarking approaches. The other objective is to spotlight initiatives showing how ministries and partners are developing, testing local benchmarks for foundational learning. So we should have our agenda should be on the screen. Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Simi. So that's our agenda for today. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping notes to take into consideration. So we have live interpretation. Please just go to your settings under channel and pick the interpretation, the language that you prefer. And I can see people are already introducing themselves. That's great. Please go ahead and tell us who you are and which organization you are from. And also note, please, that at the end of the session, we will share some of those slides. For our speakers, a gentle reminder to please speak slowly so that our interpreters can catch what you're saying. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Albert Nsengiyumva, who is the Executive Secretary of the Association for the Development of Education in Africa. Albert, over to you to please give us your opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacqueline, and thank you to everyone who has been supporting this initiative and this webinar in particular. So let me start by saying good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this important conversation on reading benchmarks in Africa. Before we dive into the inspiring work happening in South Africa and Kenya, I want to take a few moments to introduce AFLAI, the African Foundational Learning Assessment Initiative, and explain why this work matters so deeply for our continent. So what is AFLAI? The African Foundational Learning Assessment Initiative is an African initiative led by ADEA, working together with several other partners to strengthen literacy and numeracy assessment across the continent. AFLAI mission is straightforward but ambitious. We support ministries of education, examination council, and their partners by improving the quality, usability, and comparability over time on foundational learning assessment data. In other words, we want to support African countries to better understand how well their children are learning to read and do mathematics, and also use that data to actually improve teaching and learning in their classrooms. Now, this is really the most critical part of this. We do not promote a single assessment tool. We know countries are using different tools. We're not even saying use this test or use the other one. Instead, we help countries strengthen the assessment they may already be using, whether national, regional, or international. Our focus is on improving the technical quality of this assessment and assuring countries can actually use the data they collect for real decision making in their schools and classrooms. But also, we want to assure you have these resources at your disposal. In order to meet the needs of country, AFLAI operates through three complementary components. The component number one is the Knowledge Exchange Series. This is our platform for dialogue and information sharing, designed specifically for African foundational learning assessment decision makers and their technical staff. Through policy notes, blog, convenings, and peer learning activities, we surface practical lessons from across Africa, amplify African voices and perspective, and build a continental network of foundational learning assessment champions. The second is about AFLAI microsite. This is a curated platform of high-quality practical resources focused on 3 critical technical areas: item development, data collection and management, and data analysis and presentation for different audiences. We are building a repository of innovation and technology best practices. This will actually include artificial intelligence applications. The microsite will be hosted by ADEA, linked to multiple portals to maximize access across the continent, and we expect it to go live during the Foundational Learning Exchange Summit convening later this year, from 15 to 17 July in Lilongwe, Malawi. The third component is about technical assistance, a very critical component. While the microsite provides a common foundation on technical quality, we know that applying these resources is actually complex, and especially when you are dealing with real-world contexts that require hands-on support. This is why AFLAI will have a technical assistance facility available to countries at all stages of their assessment journey. Today's webinar on benchmarking is a perfect example of knowledge action series in action. We will hear directly from South Africa and Kenya about their journeys in establishing national early grade literacy benchmark. We will explore how they have tackled the challenges of foundational reading and in multiple language contexts, a challenge that resonates across our continent. But most importantly, we will hear how local assessment data is being transformed into precise, practical tools for instruction, accountability, and policy making. The question is, our webinar title is in our webinar title, what does it really take for a child to understand what he or she read? This is not just an academic. It is a question that drives teachers in classroom every day. And when we get the answer right, when we establish clear benchmark grounded in evidence from our own children and our own context, we equip our education system with the tools they need to ensure every child can read and understand. ADEA is honored to be facilitating today's discussion on benchmarking, given some of our work to improve the generation of and use of education and data on the continent through the Education Skill Data Project and data-related activities in foundational learning, such as this webinar, which align with the African Union Continental Education Strategy for Africa, and more importantly, the Continental Foundational Learning Monitoring Framework. I'm excited to hear from our speakers today and encourage you to actively participate in the Q&A session. I hope you will all enjoy today's webinar. In the end, we want to ensure that you take away practical knowledge that will help improve your education system.
Que vous des connaissances pratiques qui vont vous aider à améliorer le système éducatif dans votre.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Albert, for setting the scene and providing some really, really important context. I will now be handing over the session to Kelly Addington, who will provide an overview of some of the work that ADEA has been doing, the AFLAI team has been doing. So Professor Kelly Addington is the Director of Data First and a professor at the School of Economics at the University of Cape Town. Kelly, over to you.
Thank you, Jackie, and thank you, Albert, for that introduction. So I'm just going to speak very briefly about the blog series that this webinar builds on, that is part of the Knowledge Exchange series of AFLAI that Albert has introduced. And the blog series really explores how countries are moving from measurement to meaningful accountability by establishing their own nationally owned data-grounded benchmarks. So I suppose the obvious question is, why do we need benchmarks? Well, over the past 2 decades, countries across Africa have invested heavily in assessment. We have more data than ever before. We've got national assessments, regional assessments, program evaluations. But data alone cannot answer a very simple and fundamental policy question. Are children on track? And how far are they from where they need to be? So without benchmarks, we can describe performance, we can report averages, but we can't answer a simple policy question, is this good enough? And in multilingual African systems, this becomes even more complicated. We can't simply import standards or benchmarks from English-speaking high literacy contexts. We need to develop benchmarks that importantly reflect the structure of each language, the expectations of the curriculum, and importantly, the realities of the classrooms. So with that framing, just briefly turning to the first block, let me turn to South Africa's journey. So South Africa faced a very familiar challenge: persistent evidence that many learners were not reading with comprehension by the end of the early grades. And while the curriculum was clear on what should be taught, there were no empirically grounded targets for what proficiency actually looked like. And in a country, South Africa has 11 official languages, English-based standards were clearly inappropriate. So the South African Department of Basic Education pulled together a broad collaborative process that had both strengthened capacity in the country and led to some methodological innovations. So firstly, the team allowed learners additional time to complete the reading passage, and this enabled them to more accurately model the relationship between fluency and comprehension. And then another innovation was that instead of relying on a fixed comprehension cutoff, they looked at the full distribution to identify thresholds. So they looked for a lower threshold where decoding was so labored that learners were not able, for comprehension was not able to develop. And then again, an upper threshold where it was no longer where it was no longer fluency, but it was a lack of comprehension skills that became the limiting factor. And then the crucial part of the South African journey is that this work became institutionalized. Benchmarks are now institutionalized through study called the Funda Phumelele National Study, which has triennial national monitoring. So, I mean, that crucial institutionalization is what returns benchmarks just from some mere research output or technical tool into a systems tool. So now let me turn to Kenya. In many ways, a different journey, but also one that reinforces similar lessons. The Kenyan pathway illustrates how benchmarking can evolve over time, from program-specific tools to nationally owned standards. So Kenya had a strong assessment infrastructure, including the National Assessment System for monitoring learner achievements, together with rich programmatic data from initially the PRIMR, the Primary Math and Reading Initiative, and then later the scaled up to SOMI program. So initially benchmarks were developed within the PRIMR project, but then in 2009, there was a process where they were revised using the nationally representative to SOMI data. And I think what really stands out in Kenya's experience is the consultative nature of the process. So the Kenya National Examinations Council, together with the National Assessment Center, led a series of structured workshops. And it was here that stakeholders came together, debated various proposed thresholds, used the data to examine distributions and percentage achieving in real time, and then did the hard work of trying to balance ambition with realistic targets. And the result of this process was a framework of 4 reader categories 0 beginning, emergent, and fluent readers. And again, which are now very importantly integrated into national assessment and curriculum processes. So in Kenya, the process was not just statistical, it was institutional and consultative. The third blog in the series brings us to a continental perspective. And the third blog is from the UNESCO Institute of Statistics and adds an important comparative dimension. So there's been a lot of work done using statistical modeling, included sophisticated item response theory processes, taking data across multiple countries and time points. UIS has examined fluency comprehension relationships. And the real striking thing of this work is that these models have identified thresholds that are broadly similar to these derived through these country-led empirical and consultative processes. So that convergence is extremely encouraging. It suggests that while contexts differ, that there are these developmental regularities in reading. And at the same time, it reinforces that modeling can complement these national deliberations. The work, importantly, also provides some suggestions around how we might collectively support countries in this journey. So, across these experiences, the common themes of national ownership, alignment with the curriculum, use of local data, importantly, institutionalizing within monitoring systems. And with these conditions present, benchmarks have the potential to really shift systems from just reporting percentages to actually identifying learners at risk and enabling early intervention. And I would like to, with that summary, I would like to hand over to our first speaker, which I think is Mpumi, no, it's Efa. I'm going to hand back to Jack.
Thank you so much, Kelly, for that informative presentation. And yes, indeed, we do hand over to Efa from Kenya. So this next segment of our webinar will focus on, we'll have some country deep dives where the authors of the blogs that Kelly has just spoken about will share with us a little bit more information about their work on benchmarking. And so I see Efa Ngota has her presentation ready, and Efa is the coordinator of the National Assessment Center activities at the Kenya National Examinations Council. Efa, over to you.
Good morning, good evening, wherever we are. How are you doing today? Thank you so much for having me at this webinar. I'm happy to share Kenya's experience and just to go through what it is that Kali has summarized very well in her introductory summary. Now, it is important that we know how the process was, and for that we paint a bigger picture. The bigger picture for us came from a place where we understood what the goal was, what it was that we intended to do. I'm not so sure whether the slide can move to the next for whoever is projecting. Yes, so the goal was always to make sure that we have independent readers at grade 3. And for that to happen, it was important for us to establish what metric we would be using to measure how we are getting to that goal. Benchmarks were important to us to make sure that we are able to align ourselves to how we can be able to measure the benchmarks or the metric that we have accepted to use as a country and communicate that in terms of the target that we are able to communicate as a percentage of the children who are able to read independently at grade 3. Next slide, please. Why benchmarks? Kenya has had a very vibrant way in which we look for data, and the way in which we look for data has been mandated in the sessional papers that we have had in the government. Sessional paper number 1 of 2005 was very clear that we needed to have a way of monitoring the learning and tracking how is it that the quality of education is happening in Kenya. Now, for that, we were triggered by various situations. One being that there was introduction of free primary education, and also there was introduction of free secondary education. That happening meant that there were more numbers of students that were getting into classrooms, and there was need for us to understand whether they were just going through the grades or they were doing something that was enabling them to understand what they were reading and understanding and to post better learning outcomes. So it is important that we understand the clear way in which we established the benchmarks that we had for literacy. Next, please. The benchmarking setting process was very consultative. Kali has done a very good job just giving us a very good summary of how it was. But I want to highlight a few things. One, there was use of data that was available already in the country context. So using data that is available for a country context is very crucial. I'll just point out a few things that we learned through the process so that I don't really just belabor the point that it was a process. Now, if you have data that is appropriate for the grade that you want to be measuring learning on, it is country specific to the students that you want to be measuring the learning on. It encourages the stakeholders to take the benchmarks, to work with the benchmarks, and anybody else who wants to work in that space to use the same benchmarks to report on learning that is happening. This has to have technical consultations. And the technical consultations sometimes got a little bit very stormy, not because of anything else, but because you want to see whether achieving that goal that you have set is something that is possible. We didn't want to make such high benchmark levels that it would be impossible for us to achieve. At the same time, straining whoever is trying to make the learners achieve the same benchmarks. And at the same time, not wanting to make the floor so low that the low level benchmarks are too low and easy to achieve, cheating you or making you have the impression that learning is going on, yet nothing is really going on. Now, for me, the education stakeholders consultations were the hardest from the process that we have had through what Kali has explained. As much as it was possible to technically understand each other from a technical point of view as technical committee members in a sitting, when you bring in the teacher, when you bring in a university lecturer, when you bring in someone who is doing quality assurance at that level, when you bring in a developer, a development partner, who is interested in measuring learning, the thoughts and the dynamics shift. And you have to build a common ground where you can be able to communicate what is appropriate for the country and convenient based on the evidence that you're seeing, on the data that you have on the table. That was what was a little bit more of a complex situation for me. Now, it goes without saying that there was a review, and she has highlighted the review. There are windows of opportunities we could have as countries to drive reviews that will make us to continue targeting the goal that we want to see for our learners. One of such windows of opportunities was a change in the education system. When we were changing from the 844 education system to the competency-based education system, it provided a window of opportunity for us to look at what have programmatic interventions been doing? Where have we reached with such programmatic interventions? And how can we be aspirational in the way in which we revise and review the benchmarks to make sure that we are actually doing something that is benefiting the learners and making us understand how they are learning? So that's a place where a lot of review is encouraged, and also being inclusive, looking at who are these in our populations that also need to be told. We need to be told as policymakers on how they are learning. Now, we had to include learners who had disabilities and also include other languages, so that in a language setup, you need to understand how different languages are doing, especially those that are used for curriculum content delivery, like Kiswahili, English, and for Kenya, that is the context that we had at that point in time. Next, please. Now, We involved many people, and many meetings got to go on in this process. Apart from just the technical meetings that were held in the Kenya National Examinations Council, because the National Assessment Center was at the Kenya National Examinations Council, domiciled there by the Ministry of Education, we had the technical know-how of how to understand the different benchmarks that were there from the programmatic interventions that were going on. Now, it looks like something that can take a long time. But when you have country-specific data that can be looked at, and you have people who have the technical know-how that can understand how to guide the process, when you merge that energy, it helps you to understand faster how to be able to agree on a low or high benchmark level that is there. So apart from the technical meetings of the technical committee of the National Assessment Center, we also had education stakeholders coming on board. We had the steering committee, which now runs and is composing all the managers of the agencies of the Ministry of Education, being briefed and informed on these benchmarks for the buy-in. Having that buy-in is very important because most of the people are going to be the ones implementing, as the Teacher Service Commission, the Quality Assurance Officers, and the Kenya National Examinations Council and the Curriculum Development Body that was involved in all this. So that consultative process, bringing such people on the table, enables them to understand what it is and what the goal is and where you're going with these benchmarks. Next, please. So Kali has explained very well using the South African example, not very far from what we did in the Kenyan example, where we estimated the low benchmark level and the high benchmark level. And when we were doing that, we were putting into consideration the data that we had at grade 1 and grade 3. And later, when we got nationally representative data, we were able to move it to a level where we can review and make it better than what it was in the last years that we had already done used the benchmarks in the curriculum system. One thing I would like to point out here is that having these benchmarks used in the curriculum when we did the review made sure that the teachers have access to the benchmarks. And the learning that I really cherish from that is that the teacher was teaching, mapping their classroom assessment on the national benchmarks that were there, and at the same time, seeing the issues that they need to correct in the aspirational journey to making the learner achieve what it is that has been set as the national benchmark. We have challenges, though. This is not the only challenge that we could have as a teacher having access to the benchmark. But we do have a challenge of maybe the books and the textbooks that are in that environment of the child do not match the way in which the child would like to be aspirational in meeting the benchmarks. So that is a bigger challenge that still needs to be addressed. How are we making our textbooks to align to the various benchmarks at lower primary or lower grades so that they can be able to support the aspirations of this child achieving these benchmarks? But the teacher having the benchmarks, knowing what is the lower benchmark, higher benchmark, communicated in a language that the teacher understands. For instance, the lowest band for us is below expectation. And then we have approaching expectation, meeting expectation, and exceeding expectation, simply mapped up against the very benchmarks that we had set earlier, and aspirationally making it to be something that they can desire to see their students do. Next, please. This, we had a sort of an ability to ensure that whatever we talked about in the boardrooms ended up into documents, given the opportunities that were there at that point in time. And some of those opportunities can come in any education system. And it is important that the opportunity that avails itself for either reviewing of the benchmarks or embedding the benchmarks into curriculum support materials developed into the national assessment systems that have been done encourages us to use whatever method that we can to infuse the benchmarks that we have set as a country. So I'm looking forward to a little bit of more discussions around how we did the Kenyan journey and specifically help us to understand how we can also do this for our own countries. Thank you so much. Back to Jackie.
So much effort. Really, really interesting presentation. Thank you for sharing those the benchmark setting process and highlighting, who should be engaged in that process, how those should be aligned to the materials, and also engagement with the teachers. Really, really interesting. Thank you so much for that. Ladies and gentlemen, we move over to South Africa, and our presenter from South Africa is Dr. Mpumelelo Nyati Mogalweni, and she is the Director of Reading at the National Department of Basic Education in Africa. Mpumi, welcome, and over to you.
Good afternoon from my side. It's 4:30 in the afternoon. I'm just sharing my slide and putting it into presenter mode. It's a great honor to be able to present and share the work that we have done as South Africa. And I get the joy of building on what Kelly shared and what's been shared on Kenya by IFA. So I will leverage that and benefit from that. So South Africa has been working on the creation of benchmarks for some time now. Briefly, things I want to share are firstly that we have over time developed these sets of benchmarks for all 11 spoken official languages in South Africa in grade 1, 2, and 3. These reports that you're seeing here are examples of the range of reports we've done. For every language we benchmarked, we made sure that we produced a technical report that detailed the methodology. We produced a summary report that's more accessible and easier to read, as well as a policy brief. And for the policy brief, we made sure that we targeted that at users. So a section that said, if you were a teacher, this is how you would use these benchmarks. If you are an evaluator, a funder, or a government official, this is what this means to you. All of these reports were released as they were being produced. So since 2019, with the last one produced and shared in 2025 for English as a first additional language. These are all publicly available on our website. And I hope what you're also noticing here is a lot of donor logos on the slide. And these are partners and philanthropy organizations that partnered with us as we develop the benchmarks. A core thing we would emphasize to them, regardless of which funder it was that we were creating DBE benchmarks, that we were not creating USAID benchmarks or UNICEF or any other organization's benchmarks, but we're creating national benchmarks that are co-owned and co-shared by everyone. We also made a big effort to make everyone land on the same page to ensure that we don't duplicate efforts and find that we are creating benchmarks while others are also doing the same. A core part that we did at the beginning of the work was we commissioned the report on the left was the first. It was around setting reading benchmarks. It was a scoping about what data existed out there, what methods existed, what were the methodological limitations and flaws, and who is working in the sector. We also spent time in that report establishing what the core set of skills are for developing benchmarks, what should the sample size be, and we even determined which skills and which languages are we going to start with. I often find that as we've journeyed past that first year, we constantly go back to the setting reading benchmarks conversation and report to justify and remind ourselves about why we chose what we chose. Then a second contribution has been the Funda Uphumelele National Survey. Now that we had the benchmarks last year, we were able to finally do a national survey that assessed how many people reached those benchmarks. The reports on the left are what we produced from the survey. One is a technical report, a very long extended report explaining all the decisions we made, why we made them, sample size, etc. We then produced, again, a summary report version of this and a policy brief. But at the bottom, we added a research component to that data collection and effort. There have been a lot of questions that have been emerging about the role of morphological awareness, syntax and semantics, the other skills that are not fluency. And we thought that even though we've created fluency benchmarks, we do need to have a position about where all these other skills fall in. And we commissioned work on that and launched it at the same time. The main finding from that work was that morphological awareness and related skills have their own developmental path that is not related to fluency. They develop separately from fluency. And in the end, comprehension that's meaningful requires you to have both fluency and broader language skills. Then on the right is an example of 2 reports that are province specific. So South Africa has 9 provinces. And while all the provinces were part of the national survey, we thought it was important for us to make sure that we disseminate to each province specifically, producing their own report that focuses on the findings and languages in their province. In a province like Limpopo, which has 3 dominant languages, we were able to produce statistically meaningful results for them because the main sample for those languages came from them anyway. A similar case can be found in KZN, where they have 1 dominant language. And so the main sample also came from that province. So in those 2 provinces, we were able to give them very province-specific findings, but also have the statistical confidence to know that the findings are meaningful. In the case of a multilingual province like Gauteng, where I'm based, that was not the case. That picture reflected much more of the national picture. I think a big takeaway here that I wanted to emphasize was the importance of disseminating in multiple ways on an ongoing basis. We are still in the midst of our provincial roadshows. I think this week will mark the 9th provincial roadshow, which has been a lot of effort, but I think worthwhile work. So with that in mind, we now have goals. We know what we want. The president has declared that every 10-year-old should be able to read for meaning. Through the benchmarking work, we defined a metric. So the precursor skills that we chose to measure. We then created benchmarks. What does reading mean in each of these specific skills and languages? And the current effort should now be on targeting. Based on what we know and even some of the UNESCO work on rates of improvement, what would be a realistic target that we can set nationally and each province can set? And what other contributions that each province would be able to make? I think that is important work that needs to be part of the next phase. What was difficult has been trying to navigate the assessment landscape. So what you are seeing here is an extract from a table that shows the multiple assessments that are in South Africa. What we try to show here is a justification of why the Funda Uphumelele survey was necessary. What are its strengths? What are its limitations? Which grades? And additional criteria like how easy is it to communicate? And therefore, what distinguishes it from existing surveys like PEARLS, which South Africa participates in, SACMEC, as well as a recent national assessment. Another aspect which was both difficult in terms of coordination, but key, was the range of skills that we needed to do this work. We needed people who were experts in early grade reading. We needed people who know African languages specifically and not just speak them, but are teachers of those languages. We needed people with experience in data collection at scale. So people who are able to administer the right software, the right field workers in the short, limited amount of time you have when you're out in the field. We needed experts who understand quantitative data analysis, and not just generically, but in education. And then we needed people who can think about the research and policy interpretation and implications for this. We also took a decision quite early on to create capacity where we found that there was none. In the early days, we were told that there were no African language reading experts, and we took on that challenge. We went to the universities that dominated in those languages and walked a very slow hand-holding journey with the people that were teaching African languages in those departments. Now we have a team of about 25 linguists from across more than 12 universities and organizations with whom we've walked a very slow journey from benchmarking days right through to the national survey. Then what have the benchmarks allowed us to do that we may not have been able to do before? I'll get into that in a second, but this table shows you the use of benchmarks. They have a national and provincial use. You can use them at districts and you can use them in classrooms. And the positioning of each of these government components means that the use would be different. So at a national and provincial level, the benchmarks have helped us to establish a common definition of reading proficiency. We've been able to communicate the same uniform standards in terms of what it means for comprehension, even though the benchmarks are different for every language. And now with Funda Uphumelele, it also means we have the opportunity to monitor progress in the early grades. But at a district and school level, this allows them to track their own reading practice within districts and not wait for the national survey every 3 to 5 years. But going beyond that, what you ultimately need is a classroom level intervention, which is where we know the biggest changes happen. And so here's some of the progress we have made. We have had recently training of programmers or people we could work with in provinces who can also set the reading benchmark assessments using software that is credible. So we've increased our capacity in terms of who can create these assessments from a technical programming data collection perspective. A second thing we have done, which I have ticked in orange, is the development of a national minimum resource pack for the foundation phase. This is a call to publishers for them to submit books that the state would buy that support reading in grade 1, 2, and 3. For the first time ever, the call that came out in 2025 included the benchmarks as something to consider. So the messaging to publishers was that they would create reading materials, resources, books that allow the word length, passage complexity, and attainment towards these reading benchmarks that we've developed. We are currently developing a set of instruments that are benchmark aligned that we want to share in the sector. So this would be, we'd have a set for our own national monitoring, but we want to have a set that provinces and districts use, as well as teachers. You know about the Funda Uphumelele survey. And the last one I'll comment on here is the curriculum team has done an outstanding job in including the benchmarks in their curriculum annual teaching plans. They have been doing this incrementally. In fact, they've been impatient about when we would finally finish all the language benchmarks because they were staggered in their development. They have done what they are now calling curriculating the benchmarks into annual teaching plans. The key aspect about that is that annual teaching plans are available to every single teacher, regardless of intervention, province, exposure. They are plans that teachers need to consult as part of the curriculum. They're aware of enacting the curriculum. And so it's a big milestone to have gotten the benchmarks into the annual teaching plans. Then at a district and school level, current efforts are about improving and enhancing the early grade reading assessments. South Africa has been rolling out EGRA and participating in EGRA for at least 10 years. But the criteria that was used in the past for measuring proficiency and even benchmarking for African languages was flawed. This was extrapolated from English, and even in English, from a global North perspective, not in English at a second language level. We are working with the team in curriculum to update these assessments in terms of having them be benchmark aligned. And secondly, that the criteria in these benchmarks is correct and updated. We just got confirmation yesterday about the amount allocated for the EGRA update and printing. The effort is, or the goal is to work across between now and September to ensure that we distribute the updated EGRA toolkit to all schools. We think with the resources we have as the government, we might be able to get to maybe 40 to 50% of schools on our own, but there's an effort to galvanize partners and anyone working in our sector to join us and partner with us so that we make sure we get to the remaining missing group. Our aim is not to stagger implementation like we have in the past. We're hoping that next year, this time, we would say that we'd be able to say that all foundation phase teachers have an upgraded and printed EGRA toolkit in their hands. A further component, 2 pieces that we're doing to complement this is we are creating an EGRA core training team. We want to develop how-to videos that are in every language with a clear script about the purpose of EGRA, updated marking sheets, and a rollout that accompanies the printing. So we want to have training and printing. We have initial plans, a 3-stage cascade training model that starts in the next 3 months. And lastly, we are working with the administrative data system that's already existing and already in 90% of schools, so used by 8 out of 9 provinces. We're working with them to develop a recording part of EGRA results. We would need to work on the technical aspects, but also on the multiple users that can contribute this EGRA data. We want teachers every term to capture for each individual learner what EGRA data they have. We want districts, when they visit and monitor schools and monitor EGRA use, as subject advisors to themselves, be also able to record the EGRA results that they're finding when they monitor. And then as the national department, we want to be able to look at this at an aggregated and disaggregated level to track progress with whatever limitations that data has. We think it would be a big contribution to be able to see this data ourselves. And at the end, I'm ending with recommendations that we have. We think it is important to align whatever benchmarking work you are doing with literacy strategies. Our main win was an early conversation with curriculum where they conceded that fluency was something that was not well benchmarked or measured in their own curriculum documents, and therefore we jointly acknowledge this as a gap that research could fill. The second is ensuring that you secure funding from as many sources as possible, and you secure the funding in ways that are flexible and allow you to do the work that needs to be done. The third is ensuring that the teams are diverse and there's equity in the focus. We deliberately first worked on African languages and ended on English. And the fourth is developing benchmarks and surveys that take into mind both what's happening internationally, but even more so what's happening locally. We've been able to, I think, satisfy both international demand and appetite for measuring precursor skills. But more important to us, we've been able to address a need that's local, that's about teachers and provinces and us as the DBE, knowing what is happening in our classrooms in between international assessments. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Mpumi, for that very comprehensive presentation. It's wonderful to see, the work that South Africa has done benchmarking across all of the 11 languages and how all of that information was then subsequently integrated for teachers to have access to. So really, really great work there. So we move on to our next presentation, and our next presenter is Louis Crouch, who is a senior economist emeritus from RTI, International Development Group, and currently serves as chair of the board for the UNESCO Institute for Statistics. So he'll speak to us about benchmarking and some of the work that has been done at UIS. Prof. Louis, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you, Jackie. I'm going to suggest that we actually skip a whole bunch of slides, but just leave this one on there, but because I'm aware that we're running late, and what I think we really value about this workshop is the Q&A and the interaction. So what I'm going to do is just run verbally through most of the slides until we get to kind of the concluding ones. So let me just preface by saying that it's actually very moving to see all this, having been one of the people who started all this work about a bit more than 15 years ago, to see all this progress and seeing people doing the work better than we ever did in the early days. It's very touching. I am even though I'm chair of the board for UNESCO Institute for Statistics and also for GAML, the Global Alliance for Monitoring Learning, I'm not speaking as a representative of them. I'm speaking informed by them. So this is not an official position. And let me just offer a few reflections, and then I'll tell you what slide to skip to, Jackie or whoever's actually pushing the slides. Let me just offer a few reflections instead of reading off the slides. And that is that, remember that UIS is part of UNESCO, and UNESCO is a member organization. So we are driven by the same political masters, if you will, that you all respond to in your own countries. It's the same people, except that in our case, those political demands and policy demands come up through a huge bureaucracy, and then inevitably, because that's the way the world works, these things get sort of bureaucratized and standardized and become kind of top down and cookie cutter. But remember that the initial emphasis is from the member states and from our political leaders ultimately. And that's what they set to the world. They set to us back in 2015, the need to report and measure on skills, both in the foundation years, but also at the end of primary, at the end of lower secondary. So that's SDG 411A, B, and C. And the political message that we got from the leaders of all the countries, the ministers, is that it needed to be done on a comparable basis. So comparable is a big word. But the problem that we then faced, and still face, although we've made a lot of progress, is that precisely as Albert said in the introduction, we didn't want to say to all countries, look, you all have to use this test or that test, and everybody just please get in line. Instead, we wanted to encourage every country to use whatever assessment they found most suitable, but then that creates a problem with comparability. So that's essentially the dilemma. Now, what the various technical groups and advisory committees that we've commissioned have repeatedly emphasized is that the way the Sustainable Development Goals work and read, and the sense from the policy leadership of all the countries, is that ultimately reading is about reading with understanding. It's about comprehension. And that we need to keep a focus on that. Okay, but we then face the subsequent problem that when you measure only comprehension in a very classical way of, having kids read a paragraph and then answer a few questions, and read a paragraph and answer a few questions, because the kids were not reading at all, they were just not registering. There wasn't even really a blip. A lot of kids couldn't read a single word. So we then pivoted and said, okay, the main thing that we still are after is comprehension, and that's the main reportable, comparable thing that we'll track. But let's go one level down and try to measure also precursor skills and make those precursor skills reportable, encourage countries to report, again, on a comparable basis. And because that's in the mandate that we got from all the politicians, but then on a comparable basis and as they link to comprehension. So then the thought was, okay, we've got tons of data. People like the PAL network, people like UNICEF, people like USAID with EGRA, many people who are adopting things like EGRA, other assessments out there, had provided a whole bunch of data. So what we said was basically, can we gather all that data, or as much of that data as possible, and apply psychometric technique to analyzing in all the languages that we had, which ended up being something like I can't even remember, but about 50 languages, maybe closer to 100 when you count India, and countries, languages, and scripts, and see whether there is a methodology that can analyze the relationship between the precursor skills and comprehension in a way that essentially works for all languages and all scripts. Is that possible? Okay, and so we set ourselves that task about a year and a half ago, and I want to report on that a little bit, but not much more than this. But then what we also noted, and again, to echo Albert and to echo Callie and Efa and Mpuni, so we also said, well, but countries are already doing this on their own. They're already setting benchmarks. They're already analyzing the relationship between a fundamental skill such as fluency and the reportable skill that we all want to get to, namely, can kids, as the seminar is entitled, can kids read with understanding? And you'd have to read the report, and I'm not going to take time because it gets super technical, super quick. But the answer is yes. There are methods that can work for just about any language, and importantly or interestingly, a lot of scripts. I'm not going to say all scripts, but probably we tested the method with, I would guess, 10 or 15 scripts, forms of writing, not just the Latin script, but a lot of the Indian scripts, Arabic as well, and others. And it turns out that it's more or less the same precursor skills that eventually lead to understanding. So having told that story, and by the way, we will be giving, UIS will be giving a webinar with the psychometrician team that developed this method. We'll be doing that in early March, I'm thinking. So you're all invited, and we'll find a way to invite you all. And we can get into the technical details at that point. So let me instead focus on some of the process lessons and steps forward, because that's what I heard from Callie and others say that they wanted. So why don't you go down, just keep going super fast down to, yeah, just keep going. Okay, go back up there, back up there. So yeah, so just to report on how it turned out, a little bit about the numbers. So what we did was we analyzed some of the early, in the case of South Africa, I'll just take South Africa, but we did this for other countries as well. We took some of the early data that they had. In South Africa, we used their data from some Zulu assessments and Xhosa assessments. And we looked at the psychometric relationship between fluency and comprehension across the languages and set benchmarks, or we saw that you could set benchmarks if you group these two Nguni languages. These are what are called Nguni languages in South Africa. They're a phylogenetic class or family of languages common in South Africa, maybe Southern Africa writ large. So in a way, when we're saying Nguni here, we mean just those two, but the South Africans themselves have analyzed, I think, 4 or 5 Nguni languages. And what we said that the data suggested is that to reach 80% comprehension, you need about 42 words per minute. To reach 60%, about 27 words per minute. And that so happens that almost perfectly straddles the nationally set benchmark, which is 35. And you'll see that nationally set benchmark of 35 spans most of the confidence intervals set for the individual languages. So all that looks great. You'd have to read the report, but it turns out fairly similarly for, I don't know, something like 30 languages that we analyzed in India. And when it's not working well, we're not sure, but we think it has to do with the quality of the data or the nature of the assessment. Maybe the assessment that was used in the field was too easy or too hard. So the modeling doesn't fit. The theory of the model doesn't fit the data. We are pretty sure that when the data are good and when the assessment has been set at the approximately right level, the methodology works. So that was kind of interesting and comforting, which means that we can encourage countries to set their own benchmarks as well, as long as that setting is fairly thoughtful, and that will tend to coincide with what you could do with if you bring out the big guns psychometrically. And yeah, it's just very reassuring, because it means precisely as Albert was saying, we can encourage countries to, more or less do their own thing, and it will work out. Let's go to the next slide, where I actually have some of the lessons. Yeah, just stay right there, and then I'll give an example. And we've already gone over this, but
sorry, Louis, you have a minute left. Just a minute.
Okay, I can do it, sort of. So what we found is that the more locally driven, the better. And we saw in the case of South Africa, they basically warned the donors out, saying, "This is our stuff. Don't brand it. Don't hassle us. We'll take care of it." We also saw that the global and the local can interact usefully. So even in South Africa, they were quite informed by global trends and global analyses. The third point was, you need to do deep linguistic analysis. You can't just copy an English test, and we refer to this. English is a terrible language to model on for complicated reasons. So please, no translations, not even mere adaptations. You have to really analyze the language in question deeply. And ideally, you have to use fit-for-purpose data, not just in generic reading data that are meant to establish the benchmarks. Later on, you can do other kinds of data. And as we saw in South Africa and in Kenya, just involving government, academic, civil society, the teachers, everyone. Not everyone will have the same role. But if you get all those people involved, it will maximize usage. And after all, this is not just about reporting to UIS, it's about using it locally. I'll have one more slide, and I can go super quickly through that. Just go ahead, just show the last slide. Yeah, and so the tasks that we see at having studied the countries and having studied is that some of the next steps that we would recommend is to protocolize. It's actually a real word. So protocolize the best case study. So take the Kenya example, the South Africa example, eventually maybe the India example, and kind of turn them into a protocol that countries can follow to set their own benchmarks. What are the skills you need? What is the process that has been used? There are some important languages and language groups that are missing. So there might be some West African languages that are across countries. Spanish has not been researched well enough. And one idea might be for donors or sort of donor coordinators, like the folks in this meeting, to intentionally fund a process that goes from soup to nuts. Some of the cases that we heard are really good, and they went through these processes, but they were kind of making it up as they went along. So what would happen if we learned from the best cases that have made it up as they went along, protocolarize it, as I said it, and apply it with intentionality to some new countries? And that's why I drew that kind of self-feeding yellow circle there. We need better and more work on the linguistics and orthographic analysis to firm up our knowledge. We're still not quite there. We can improve the psychometrics, and we need to work to catch up on mathematics. And one important issue that I think could be done from a global level, useful to countries, is to improve and develop standardization around how difficult the items could be or should be. So you set up a little paragraph and then some questions. Well, what's a good standard of difficulty for that? That's never been quite worked out. So that's it.
Right. Great. Well, thank you so much, Louis, for that presentation. Really, really informative. And it's so amazing how you touch on, some of the other some themes that have already been dealt with in the previous presentations. Great recommendations. Definitely make a lot of sense. Hopefully, you can share a bit more in our next session, which is a panel discussion. So we will be going deeper into the experiences that our speakers have shared through a moderated discussion. After that, we will have a Q&A session. So please do feel free to post some questions you might have in the chat, and we will deal with them as we move along. So Kelly, over to you to please moderate the session. Thanks.
Thank you, Jackie, and thank you to the three presenters for really rich, insightful presentations. I'm going to move straight into questions for the panelists in the interest of time. And if I'm going to borrow Luis's new word, protocolize, and really just ask you to reflect on Kenya's journey. What scalable lessons would you highlight for other countries embarking on this process? So, thinking through like what elements of your process are like transferable, maybe what things would you tell countries to avoid or not do? But if you could if you could protocolize for us a little, over to you, Effa.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kelly. I'm happy to have listened to everything in a short while, but what I can recommend for any country as scalable from our journey is that you have to budget for more than one meeting. You would need to have a meeting that is technical enough to go into the field, collect the information, put it together, set the standardization processes, but you need to think in terms of who else needs to come onto the table for the ownership of this information. You also need to think in terms of how do I make this sustainable in terms of the use of the benchmarks? What windows of opportunities are availing themselves, either through education reforms or curriculum developments that could be going on, or teacher retooling that could be going on, or textbook developments that could be going on. All these are windows of opportunities that anybody can pick for purposes of making sure that they make the benchmarks available to the teacher. When a teacher, the curriculum developer, the assessor, and the learner are working from the same page, it makes learning outcomes better, especially when they are doing the reading part of it.
Thank you so much, Effa. That comes, that sort of collaboration and including everyone in the process came through very clearly in your presentation and in your blog. I'm going to switch to Phumi now, and the South African experience, really showed it's not just about doing the technical work and identifying the benchmark, but it's, a lot of what you spoke about was embedding it into the policy, into the curriculum and so on. I wonder if you can share with us, again, from your perspective and experience, what enabling conditions are most critical in ensuring that there's this national ownership and that there's this sustained impact? So, thinking through what are the political factors that make it possible for benchmarks to improve, to move from research to actually move into systems? And again, if thinking through any advice that you would be offering countries who wanting to have sustainable benchmarks in their system.
I think similar to Effa in terms of not budgeting for one meeting, is create a lot of time for conversations, getting on board different people, and making it clear to them why this is a useful thing for them. So it's a different conversation when we are speaking to our curriculum colleagues. A key step there, and I think a gap that a lot of us researchers fall into, is not doing enough work to understand what's in the actual curriculum. So it then appears as though you're critiquing something you haven't read. So in our case, having read the actual foundation phase curriculum, I could go up to them and say, look, you speak about assessments and that fluency is important, but you don't give an actual number of what fluency looks like. And then we're engaging on an actual point, and they can conceive that there's a conversation to be had there. A different conversation is with subject advisors, for example, who monitor what's happening in schools. The conversation with them was that while using benchmarks is adapting and maybe extra work in terms of having someone read to you, it is a way to empower you as a subject advisor to know where the children in your school are at and to not just rely on the written marks that are submitted to you. So for the framing for them is more data that empowers them to then act. And then a different and more difficult conversation is with politicians, because knowing what we know about the benchmarks, it was even before we did the survey, we're anticipating getting high numbers of children who don't reach the benchmarks. And why would they do this? And I think for us, it was saying to them, participating in international assessments like PEARLS has actually been one of the most strategic ways we've been able to capture progress in South Africa. So even though we are at the bottom, we're actually improving. And if we did not participate in these international assessments, we would not have any tools to measure this. We would be reliant on anecdotes and whatever the media has chosen to pick up. And so the conversation to them is saying, hey, look, if we measure, we'll know where we are. And this is a local skill that is much earlier on, and that would empower us to intervene in grade 1, in grade 2, in grade 3, not waiting for the assessment that happens once every 5 years, and that's international. And so, yeah, I think those different conversations and communicating both the risk and what people will gain has been powerful for us.
Yeah, really fascinating to hear the importance of bringing people along from early on in the process, but then also emphasizing that the real work really starts once the benchmarks are set. So yeah, fascinating parallels across the two. Over to Louise now. Louise, I was one. So we see now, how these sort of statistical analyses can really complement and be part of what informs these national deliberations. But I'm wondering if you could share with us how, if at all, you think these benchmarks might be used. We've heard about them being used at the classroom level, at the system level, nationally. But how might these benchmarks be used in a continental way? Because the benchmarks are obviously not reporting for SDG 4.1.1a exactly, and they're on these precursor skills. Are there opportunities for using these benchmarks in a continental way?
Well, I would say that before using them, you have to set them. So, and when you're talking about the continent of Africa, I think it would make most sense to me, but this is subject of debate. There's no one continental language, right? So if I were AFLAI or other bodies in Africa, such as ADEA, start maybe thinking about what are coalitions of countries where there's a language that's spoken widely in more than one country. So let's say Yoruba, which is in Nigeria, Benin, and Togo, or Hausa, which is spoken widely in many countries in West Africa, or the Fulfulde, Fulani, Pula sort of linguistic groups, and encourage either a country with a large population of that language who are already attempting to use that language to teach reading. So that's an important precondition. Are those countries actually attempting to use those languages for the teaching of foundational reading and decoding and so on? So, and if they are, you could either get one of those large countries to take the lead or try to create a coalition of, let's say, 3 countries where there's a lot of kids that are being taught in a particular language, and then work on those benchmarks. While at the same time, from a continental level, working on making the benchmarks comparable, because it's one thing to create them and making them locally relevant, which has to go through the individual languages. I think I don't see any other way. But then at a continent level, you may want to think about how to make sure that what's happening in these particular languages remains comparable, because I think the politicians do care about, they look at what other countries are doing, and while they might sometimes say, well, we don't want to be compared, in reality they do. So I think working at those two levels is what would make sense to me, is working on individual languages, ideally the ones that are pretty big and spoken by a lot of kids, ideally in a group of countries. So, and I can think of some in West Africa, but there's also Kiswahili in Eastern Africa. And I think some of the languages that you guys were working on in South Africa are Southern, not just South Africa. There's some that are spoken in Botswana and also Zimbabwe, Eswatini, and so on. So, working at that level, while at the same time working continentally in making sure that those things are then comparable across those languages.
Thank you, Luis. Yeah, I mean, I see the development at both levels, and I think what could be eventually very powerful, if we see so many children are not meeting these minimum proficiency levels, to have something else on these foundational skills that can let us see, sort of track something that we can look at incremental progress better across the continent, could be really powerful. I'm going to hand over to Jackie, I think, now for Q&A, because I feel, or Jackie,
there is just one just one question in the chat I thought we could the speakers could attend to. Are there any technology software available to teachers in South Africa to help them assess the learners' reading levels versus the benchmarks? So I guess one of you can take that, either Mpumi, maybe Kelly.
I mean, I can speak very briefly within the provinces. There's quite a lot of work going on, working with subject advisors and teachers and trying to integrate these sort of quick assessments into their EMIS, into their whole EMIS system. They all at sort of pilot phases happening across, I think, at least 3 provinces. I don't know, Pumi, if you have anything to add on those.
Yeah, I think there is some technology work as well that's happening. There are conversations around which software to use, what's going to be most efficient. But I think the thing we're trying to juggle is to whatever software we're going to use, including technology like tablets, needs to be something that the system can sustain, even beyond next year, next month. When the tablet breaks, what then? And secondly, to cater for teachers that may not want to use technology. And so we're going both paths, so that we make sure we're not technology dependent.
Can I add something that Mpumi showed me from South Africa, which reminds me and should remind everyone that even paper and colored ink are technology. And she showed me this wonderful thing that you've developed in South Africa, where you show the passage and then the number of words in each line, and there's a color coding that says if the kid got through here, the kid is reading at 20. If the kid got through here, and it's all color coded and very clever. I don't know if it's being widely used now, but I guess my one advice about technology is don't think that technology is digital only. It can be good old pencil, paper, and colored ink.
Yeah, great. We have so many questions coming through the chat and the Q&A platform. In the interest of time, what we will do is we will share responses to these questions and unanswered questions via email. It's really, really good to see this level of participation. Kelly, do you have one more contribution or question with the panel?
I just made my questions really short in order to open more time for Q&A. from the audience. So I think let's hand over to more questions from the audience.
Okay, so we have a bunch of questions.
Okay.
Yes, I do. So this is from Igal, and he's asking what evidence and national data should inform the development of a new reading benchmark for foundational learning in grade 3, and how can we ensure it aligns with the national curriculum and language policy? It's a loaded question. So yeah, I'm not sure who can take maybe just the first part because we're also running out of time now.
Maybe I could help.
Yep.
Sorry. Maybe I could help with the Kenyan example, where it is best that you use the available country-specific context data for the level. If you're looking for grade 3, do not use grade 2. Do not use grade 1. Do not use grade 4. Use the level that is appropriate, and it should be from the country, meaning the people, the students themselves have been exposed to that curriculum that you would like it to be aligned to in the long run. So make it as local as possible. Use the available data. If you have nationally representative data, the better, because it will give you a better picture of what it is that you would have to use for the country context. So stick to the level, stick to the appropriateness, stick to the way in which you would want to see based on the curriculum that you're exposing those learners you want to measure their benchmarks on. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Effa, for those questions, for that response. And at this point, we will close the Q&A session just to allow enough time for our closing. Thank you so much to our speakers for coming through today. We really, really appreciate your insights. Conversations will continue in the background. We will share responses to the questions as well as the presentations that we had today. So, a couple of themes that I picked up that kept resonating when it comes to benchmarking, national ownership, multi-sector engagement, linguistic inclusivity, data-grounded decision-making, and sustained policy integration, all, themes that have been coming through and through. So just wanted to very quickly, we have codes on the screen. Could you please just take a minute to fill in our evaluation form? Using the codes on the screen, but also I want to take this opportunity to just inform you about what's coming up in what's next in our knowledge series over the next few months. So as part of the series, there will be additional blogs. Kelly already spoke about some that we've published, but there will be additional blogs that will come through. And these blogs will focus on topics such as AI and assessment, FLN assessment planning for effective administration, data use, language considerations and assessment. So please be on the lookout for all of these. I hope you've all had an opportunity to provide feedback. Ladies and gentlemen, this is where we end our webinar. It's been an absolute pleasure having you, all the wonderful interactions, and we will definitely keep you posted of any new developments. Thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your day. If you haven't, QR code is still on the screen. Please do provide us feedback. Thank you so much. Merci beaucoup. Thank you. Obrigada. Obrigado. It's been wonderful having you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're just giving a few seconds for anyone who has not scanned the QR code for feedback. Please do so before we close. We officially close the meeting. All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your week.